Hi guys, this lecture is looking at the structure-agency debate in sociology. This one's going to focus particularly on the structuralist side of the argument. I'm going to run through a brief introduction to the structure-agency debate. I'm going to explain, using C. Wright Mill's sociological imagination, the evidence perhaps for the structural argument. And we're going to go through a few different examples to illustrate that actually perhaps we do live in a very structural world, even if many of us would like to have our own free will. So before we get started properly, just have a quick think about what is the structure versus agency debate. This is something we'll have looked at the beginning of your sociology course. And there's a few questions there that will help you understand the difference between either a structural theory or an agency theory. So if you're a structuralist, you'll be interested in how our individual actions are actually influenced by larger social and cultural structures in society. So any examples of social and cultural structures that you can think of, structures that predetermine your behaviour. If you're completely flummoxed, I'll run through one with you, but I'd like to think of a couple of others just to annotate. One you'll be very familiar with is the structure of class. Your economic position is a structure. There are also things like family, by the way, that's also another structure, just to give you a second example. But of course, your class will influence your actions. It will influence sort of education you end up having. It will influence how you speak. It will influence how you act. To an extent, it might influence how you walk into a room, for example. So that is an example of how a structure can influence your behaviour and actually your life chances and outcomes. Or you may be on the agency side of the argument, which they believe that we actually perhaps create the social world around us through our interactions and repeated behaviour. So the only reason a structure like perhaps class appears to believe is because individuals have chosen to act in that way, and now when we look at individuals, we look at things like how they dress and what they wear, and we look at those symbols and we decide actually that means they're in a particular class. And it's only because we as individuals and as humans repeat behaviour that we create that social world and those categories. It comes from us. It's not structures that are actually affecting our behaviour. And you need to be aware of which research methods are associated with each approach. So in terms of the positivism and interpretivism debate, you should be able to make links between, if you're a structuralist, you're clearly going to use positivist research methods because they prefer large amounts of objective data you can spot patterns in. Whereas if you're an interactionist, you really want to get close to meanings that people have for different interactions, what's going on inside people's heads, and the impact of people's reactions on individuals. And you can only really get to those ideas and that knowledge through using interpretivist methods, for example. This is just an overview that I'd like you to kind of annotate and get down of the different structural and agency theories. I'll just talk you through it really briefly. So in the structural side, you've got your Marxism, functionalism, feminism. Concepts associated with these theories when it comes to the structural agency debate. Determinism, or being deterministic. They believe that we don't have free will. Our actions are predetermined by the social structures around us. They are macro. They look at society on a huge scale. It's top down. It's social structures and society more important than the individual. Social laws and facts exist. You should be able to make some links there, possibly with Durkheim's study of suicide, a functionalist using positivist research methods. The idea that if someone is suffering anomie, they are far more likely to commit crime, particularly suicide, for example. Their ideas are generally generalizable because they are done in such a broad scale, for example, and they believe human behaviour is predictable. Methods they prefer, quantitative, positivist, I've already discussed, so things like official statistics, closed questions and structured interviews, all of which can be easily analysed for patterns that you can use to create those social laws. On the agency side, and our students generally and sometimes staff lack confidence for some of these theories, but you do know them and you have covered them in the different topics that you've looked at. So symbolic interactionism, if you like, is almost like the umbrella theory or social action theory. Both theories believe that it is very much about individual social actions that create society around us. So labelling theory you'll be very familiar with, and we've also going to look very briefly at phenomenology and ethnomethodology in terms of our understanding of how the social world is created by individuals. But don't worry about too much about those right now. Key concepts associated with this side of the argument would be free will. We have it. It's bottom up. They're very interested individuals. That's a micro theory. So, for example, they will, in an education setting, they wouldn't just be interested in league tables. They'd want to get into a classroom and figure out what exactly is going on, what processes are going on in that classroom that creates that data. They believe in choice. Their studies are small scale. They seek meaning. They want to get to meaning. So that word verstehen, how do you get to understand your subjects? Symbols are key. So what sort of symbols do we use to understand individuals? I talked about language earlier on. That's a type of symbol. The way someone speaks will give you an indication of, what are they like? What's their class? What's their ethnicity? Are they nice? Are they horrible? And as well as the process of social construction, the idea that society can create meaning, can create rules about things that can then become true. And gender is always a good example to illustrate that. And I always use the example of being pink. Pink is seen as a girl's colour, but obviously that's not a fact. That's not a biological fact. That's not a scientific fact. It is something that we have come to believe as a society, and as a result, if you dress a baby boy in pink, that would be quite unusual because everyone would be like, oh, it's a boy, it should be in blue, because we associate pink with that particular gender. Methods are interpretivist, qualitative, and I've mentioned Verstehen. They favour things like participant observation, and probably most valid, if you like, would be covert participant observation because the participants would behave normally. Group interviews, because people can talk very openly. Use of open questions in interviews, so people can explain themselves. And in an unstructured interview format, because people will be more relaxed and you'll build up more rapport. So that's just a brief overview that I'll return to at the beginning of the next lecture as well. So I quite like looking at the structure debate, particularly using C. Wright Mills's sociological imagination that we had looked at briefly at the beginning of year 12. Now, he argued that we need to develop a sociological imagination. We need to identify how actions are influenced by wider social forces. And you probably already have a sociological imagination. You might look at, behaviour on a school bus, for example, and think, why do those kids always sit in those seats? Is it because of their age? Is it because, if they get the back of the bus, is that where the older kids sit? Is that because of a status thing? So you might have already had these sort of thoughts. So you probably have a sociological imagination already, hopefully. And Mills was actually very critical of mainstream sociology in the sort of 1940s, 50s. He felt that all they did was measure stuff that was happening and maybe report on it, but they didn't really make any change, and they sort of left it up to politicians to decide if they wanted to change anything, and quite often they didn't, particularly in that time period when it was very right-wing in many of the governments, particularly in America, for example, where he's writing. So he said, actually, the sociologists, they actively need to translate private troubles into public issues. They need to raise the awareness of these public issues, and they need to try and get government to change policy to make things better for people. So when I try and explain to you guys about what a private trouble might be, we all have them. You might have one right now, so you might want to have a think about which one you might have. But I've given you a couple of examples. Having a car accident is a very private trouble. It can be completely random. It can be nothing. It might not be your fault, or it could have been your fault because you sneezed when you were around a corner and you went into a lamppost. But it is a complete accident, and it can feel like a very private trouble. You might be very stressed with exams. But the thing is, as Mills said, is if there's enough people having these private troubles, then actually there could very well be a structural cause to the problem. And it's a sociologist's job to kind of connect sort of what might be the wider structural cause of lots of people having car accidents, for example. Or is your private trouble actually going to cause wider social ripples? Now, if a lot of people are having car accidents, then I'd say, that's going to cause social ripples, because if lots of people have car accidents, other people are going to be harmed, including the drivers themselves. So that is a significant social issue. It's going to cause social ripples. And it could well be, people have car accidents on a particular road because there's not enough street lighting. Or people have car accidents on a particular road because there's a pothole and people swerve to avoid it. And if that is happening enough and people are really suffering a private trouble, it's clearly causing a public issue, then an easy structural solution to this is, get the environment department of the local authority to fix the pothole or put in street lights, for example. And ta-da, that kind of solves the private trouble and makes society as a whole function much better. If lots of you have the same problem, then it is quite likely there's a social and structural cause. Quite often around about this time, stress is an issue amongst young people doing exams, and lots of you will suffer stress, and of course we can connect that to a structural problem. It's because our system of assessment is very much exam driven, and that can cause quite a lot of mental health issues amongst young people. The issue is kind of raising that as a social issue and trying to get the government to perhaps introduce support for young people, or even change the way of assessment to kind of reduce this bottleneck that most of us go through around about this time of year. Now, Stuart Mills can sound a bit Marxist sometimes in his ideas, but he's not actually a Marxist, even though he was a bit of a fan of Marx. And he did say that the reason he's not really a complete Marxist is because he says individuals are very much responsible for making the best of the situation. And he did say that the individual must do as much as possible to make the best of it. But if the structure needs to be altered, then we should point this out and we should try to help that individual make the best of the situation they're in. So this is another example here that I'll just whiz through. An individual's working, they're paying their bills, they're studying, they blow a tyre on their car, which meant they can't fix it because they haven't got any money, and maybe they can't get to their course, and they can't get to their job. Now this person's clearly trying to do as much as possible to be a good citizen. But the structure of society needs to be adjusted to perhaps help them carry on being a good individual, a good citizen. So you need a good social policy to help them. So if you can think of one, you can annotate it on your notes. That'd be great. One that pops up every year that I'll give you, if you can think of another one as well, would be, introducing free travel for students up to the age of 18 on buses, for example. And that would mean they'd still be able to get to college, they might still be able to get to their job, and they can carry on being a good citizen despite the fact they've had a setback with their car tyre blowing out. So these are some examples of structural or wider social problems that you're probably aware of. So if a few children in 60 million are obese, then this isn't a massive problem. But annoyingly and sadly in the UK, it's more like 9.3%, almost 10% of 4 to 5-year-olds are obese. And that's a huge number. That's 1 in 10. So this is clearly a social problem. It is a social problem because it's going to put strain on the NHS. These young people might grow up to be obese. They might not be able to access jobs. They might not be able to go to work every day because of being sick. So this is going to cause quite a number of problems for society. So we need a policy to solve it. So in order to come up with these policies, you need to work out what's causing the problem. So you need to look at the structural causes of obesity. So it could be the increased access to fast foods around schools, for example. Cuts to PE time in schools, so there's less physical activity for young people. It could be parents being too busy because the pressures of work mean they haven't got the time to perhaps make those nutritional meals. So we need to come up with social policies to perhaps solve this obesity. So can you think of any policies the government's come up with to try and make young people a bit more healthy, a bit more active, eat better? I'll give you one. Just have a quick think about what's happening with your school dinners, for example, in the canteen. When I was your age, when I was younger, you could quite easily get a chicken burger and a Mars bar for lunch. Can you get that now? And maybe think why not? So think of anything else that's perhaps been about solving obesity. So just talking about social policy in a bit more detail, what is actual social policy? Social policy is when the government attempts to do something about social problems, and it can cover a range of areas such as security, education, work, health, well-being, crime. Now, social problems are issues that are harmful to the rest of society. So I just mentioned crime, so a high crime rate, burglary, for example. If you get a high number of burglaries, you need to perhaps come up with a social policy to stop burglaries. Now, you might want to analyse this from a left and right realist point of view. So can you think of any social policies that left realists might come up with to solve the problem of burglary? And likewise, what would perhaps a right realist come up with to kind of solve the problem of burglary? And C. Wright Mills, again, going back to his point, he said that this is what sociology is all about. You need to connect private problems to public issues. Okay, what is the private problem that's perhaps leading to someone being a victim of burglary, or what is the private problem of the individual who is choosing to become a burglar? We need to connect these to public issues, and we need to come up with social policies to solve these issues, okay, to make life better, to make society function more smoothly, even though he wasn't a functionalist. Another example down here, like suffering cancer, can feel like a private struggle, but sadly, 1 in 2 men will get cancer in their lifetime. This is a massive social problem. So can you do the same analysis for cancer? Why are people getting cancer? What are the causes of cancer, structural causes? Think about the media, think about the workplace, think about advertising, think about products. What are the things that are causing cancer? And then once you identify those causes, you can come up with a solution. So I'll give you a little hint here. You might want to think about smoking, perhaps, and go through that analysis using smoking. The example I've got you to think next slide is about skin cancer. Maybe link this to globalization. What is it about our lives now that mean people are exposed to higher levels of sun damage? Going on. Well, what can we do? What can we get access to because of globalization? That means that more people perhaps are likely to suffer skin cancer linked to sunbathing. And you can have that analysis as well, and think about what has the government introduced, or how do they try and discourage people from lying out in the sun and baking themselves to a crisp. This is perhaps a very useful example to think about when you're trying to talk about the sociological imagination and the structural debate in society. It's looking at the issue of domestic violence, which many of you have looked at through gender and crime. Now, domestic violence will feel and is a very private trouble for a victim. People don't talk about it. It takes place in the privacy of the home. But what I'd like you to do now is annotate on your notes, explain how it can feel like a private trouble. And then what I've given you is, if you like, the causes of domestic violence. Like, why does it take place in those yellow bubbles? Now, it's issues about masculinity. So how can masculinity cause domestic violence, if you can annotate that? There is race and ethnicity issues. There are patterns of domestic violence that vary between different racial and ethnic groups. It can be linked to ideas around religion and culture and the role of women, for example. Financial problems. Domestic violence generally increases in times of recession when people lose their jobs. There's more arguments about money. And sorry, just to be clear, in this case, I've just looked at domestic violence as with women being victims. And that top right-hand corner, it mentions that the reason I've done that is because the majority of victims are women, although I do acknowledge that there are increasing numbers of male victims of domestic violence at the moment. But roughly 1 in 4 women in the UK will experience domestic violence in their life, and this has increased in 2018. It increased by 23% from the previous year. So it is an issue. It's not just a private problem. It's certainly a social problem, because there's a huge number of victims here. And why is it happening? So yeah, thinking about back to the yellow bubbles, how did gender stereotypes lead to domestic violence? About strength for men and the role of women. Like should they listen to their husbands? Should they take direction from their husbands? Or not even husbands, it can be boyfriends, of course, or just men in the family, like fathers. There's also socialisation, not just from the family, although of course that's important in terms of explaining why domestic violence might take place. There's also socialisation from the media, which is the next bubble along, but also the peer group links very strongly to masculinity. Does a male peer group make domestic violence more likely to take place in the home because of their norms and values about status and physical dominance, for example? Then yes, of course, we've got the role of the media. Does the media favour a certain type of family model? And if those expectations aren't met, does that cause frustration in the home? The media, in terms of sport reporting, can perhaps lead to domestic violence because there's that famous poster of every time England loses a football match, domestic violence spikes in the UK. In England. The workplace, what's going on in the workplace that's perhaps leading to increased domestic violence. Now, this can be processes like deindustrialisation, the closure of factories in the UK as we move towards a service economy. All those jobs that typically men did, very much, and working class men possibly as well, They suddenly lose their breadwinner status. That's where they got their source of masculinity, was being the provider for their home. So they have to seek other ways to kind of provide that masculinity, or be that masculine role, be that masculine person. But also in middle class workplaces as well, we've seen much more female managers. So middle class men going to work, being dominated by a female manager. That's obviously infringing on their sense of masculinity, and perhaps they struggle with that. So they might come home and they might then assert their masculinity on their households. And it's not just female, as in like girlfriends and wives who are victims, but also children who are victims very often of domestic violence. And of course, all these things are linked to wider patriarchy, linked back to hegemonic masculinity. It comes from schools, it comes from the media, it comes from the family, patriarchy, this idea that women are to an extent subservient to men. And that's the way it is, and that's the way it should be, that kind of patriarchy idea. So I feel like I've done that bit for you. But this activity, what I'd like you to do is to now think, well, what are the social problems then that this level of domestic violence can cause? So if 1 in 4 women are going to be victims of domestic violence, why is this a huge social problem? And now hopefully you can come up with some points. For example, it means 1 in 4 women are perhaps going to end up in hospital because they get significantly harmed psychologically or physically by domestic violence. But there are obviously other issues. You think about the children in the home. But what do you think? The final point, I guess, is the solutions to domestic violence. So the government knows about this stuff. We've got statistics on it. It's quite likely that statistics are actually under-reporting the level of domestic violence. But what would you think would be a good solution to domestic violence? Now, to do this, according to Dixie Wright Mills, you need to understand the causes, which I've given you in the yellow bubbles there. What solutions can you come up with for domestic violence linked to one or more of those yellow bubbles? How could you stop domestic violence because of one of those causes? And that would be you using your sociological imagination for what is a very complex problem in UK society. So, what I'd like you to do at this point, and sorry that this slide's gone a bit funny, is explain in your own words what a sociological imagination is. The best way to do this, and I'd like to do this in an analytical paragraph, because you could get something on the structure agency debate in a 10-mark essay or a 20-mark essay. So you are going to need to analyse your points in quite a lot of depth to get the top bands, is to talk about an example to illustrate the sociological imagination, and particularly link the sociological imagination to structure. So think of one of the examples I've given you today, or perhaps your own examples of a private trouble. I'd like you to then link it to a wider structural cause of that private trouble. I'd like you to explain that if enough people suffer, or there's quite a large number of people having those private troubles, why that's actually a big problem for society. And then I want you to do that final part, which is the social policy part. I want you to think of what is the social policy solution to that private trouble, whichever example you've chosen. And that's what I'd like you to do for now.